Guys, today we are going to do the central nervous system, right? So we'll do the peripheral nervous system once we're done with the central nervous system, right? So you know that the central nervous system, it's your brain and your spinal cord. So the central nervous system, today our main focus is on the brain. So the brain is a very important organ in your body. It is basically it's not really the most important, because the heart is also important, but we are able to do everything that we're doing because of the brain, right? So every single activity that you're doing, it's because of the brain. And so since it's the important structure, it requires serious protection, right? So the brain is protected by the skull, it's protected by your meninges, it's protected, it's your skull and your meninges, the most important ones, right? So I won't mention this, I won't say anything about the skull today, so I want us to focus on the meninges. So we have three meninges all in all, right? So the easiest mnemonic is DEP, right? So this is your dura mater, your arachnoid mater, and your pia mater, in this order, right? Starting from the outside going to the inside, right? So your dura mater has two layers. It's further divided into two layers. You have the periosteal and the meningeal layer. This is the outer layer. This periosteal, then followed by meningeal. But both these layers are dura mater, and then it's followed by arachnoid mater, and then followed by pia mater. So once you understand that, we are still going to dwell more on the arachnoid space and what happens in there if you get an infection and everything. But for now, I just want to do I just want to give you a great overview of the brain, right? So let's assume that this is your brain, right? This is the anterior part, and then this is the posterior part of the brain, right? Your brain is divided into lobes, right? Remember that your skull was divided into, you had to remember that your skull, you had the sutures, you had what we call sutures that divided the skull into regions. You had your parietal, your frontal, your temporal, and everything. So the same thing here, but instead of it being divided by sutures, it's divided by what we call sulcus, right? But these sulcus are just minor regions, right? The major regions that are dividing it is fissures. So let me explain the difference between the two. What divides the lobes, right? Let's say here, if I were to draw a line there and then draw another one, like something like this, right? This would be my frontal lobe, this would be my parietal lobe, this would be my temporal lobe, and this would be my occipital lobe. So what are these things that are dividing these lobes? They are fissures, right? Sulcus divide the brain into areas, specific areas, right? The brain has what we call, on the outer surface, the brain is not this smooth, right? It has bumps which are called gyri or gyrus, right? So let's take this section of the brain and then we zoom in, we bring it here, right? So the section of the brain would appear to be something like this. Let's say this and then this. It's something like this, it's rough, right? So this or what we call gyri, and then these gyri are divided. What divides the gyri is the sulcus, right? These depressions in between, these grooves in between going downwards, they are sulcus. So what's the difference between a sulcus and a fissure? A fissure goes a little bit deeper compared to the sulcus. So if it goes way deeper than the sulcus, we call it what? A fissure. So where do you find the fissures? You only find the fissures where you divide the lobes of the brain, right? This is the fissure, this is the fissure, and this is another fissure. They divide the brain into four lobes, which is the frontal, the parietal, occipital, and the temporal lobe, right? All these lobes have their specific functions, right? One thing about the central nervous system, and the reason why most people don't understand the central nervous system, it's because of the many functions that it has, right? And before I can even go there, the brain is mainly divided into, because it is broad on its own, we divide it into the, if I will show you the top view of the brain, right? We have something like this, right? These are what we call cerebral hemispheres, right? These are what we call cerebral hemispheres. Basically, it's your cerebrum, right? Which is the most largest area in your brain. And your cerebral hemispheres are connected by a structure here in between, which is called corpus callosum, right? That is what I want you to know for now. And then, while we are still there, the cerebral hemisphere, which is the cerebrum, is further divided into specific smaller areas, right? But remember that the brain, here we have the brainstem. We have the brainstem, right? We have something like this, and then here you have the cerebellum, right? So your brain will divide it into this, the whole of this upper part, it's your cerebrum. And then somewhere here, before the brainstem starts, on top of the brainstem, we have something we call the diencephalon, right? Which is on top of the brainstem. And then here, the top part of the brainstem, this one we call it the midbrain. And then you have the pons, and then you have the medulla oblongata. So the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, all these three, that is what we call brainstem. So the brainstem is made by midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. We'll go into each area more specifically. And then on the posterior part of the pons, that is where you find your cerebellum. We have the cerebrum, we have the cerebellum. This one is mainly for balance, right? So when you, since you understand the basic parts we have of the brain, I want to tell you the major areas of the brain, right? But before you can even go there, while you are still on the meninges, the function of the meninges, the number one function, we said it's protection, right? So it protects the brain, but that's not the only thing that the meninges do, right? The meninges also, they also protect the blood vessels, and then they contain what we call SCF, right? Which is your cerebrospinal fluid, right? And then while we are still on the cerebrospinal fluid, we'll go and discuss what we call the ventricular system, right? This ventricular system is a system of ventricles which produce, right? They contain the cerebrospinal fluid. Remember that which cells produce the cerebrospinal fluid, which we did, which is a part of the neuroglial cells, right? We said they are ependymal cells. So the ependymal cells are the cells that are found in the ventricles, right, of the brain. They produce what? They produce the cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid circulates in the ventricular system, right? We have 4 ventricles in the brain. We have 4 ventricles, right? So you must know which of 4 ventricles, where they're situated, and what so forth, right? Later on, when we have a live session, I'll try to put pictures, right? I won't do it like this. I'll try to put pictures so that it's more visual and you see what I'm talking about, right? But for now, please check everything that I'm saying in your textbook. But if you go to your brain, if we only focus on the ventricular system, you'll see that in the cerebrum, we have, let's say, okay, let me continue with, you have something that is like these 2 structures, right? I'm only drawing one. Let's say this is one on the left side. You'll have another one on the right side, right? We call this one a lateral ventricle, right? You'll have another one. So meaning that you have 2 lateral ventricles, right? And we said that we have how many ventricles? 4. And then where they meet down there, somewhere here you'll have your third ventricle. That's the name of that ventricle. It's called the third ventricle. And then when you go downwards like that, it extends. This ventricle comes here, right? It's like it's going like that. So this is where you find the fourth ventricle, which is the one that I drew here. This is fourth ventricle. Where's the fourth ventricle found? It's found in the cerebellum, right? So that's your four ventricles. It's two lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle, right? So don't say what's the name of the third ventricle. It's called the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle is called the fourth ventricle. So what do? They contain the cerebrospinal fluid, and it circulates in the brain, and then it goes to the spinal cord. We'll do the spinal cord, and then you'll see how it just goes straight on the spinal cord, right? And then if they want to, they use the cerebrospinal fluid to check if you have any infections in the brain or in the spinal cord. So the process or the procedure by which they will draw out this cerebrospinal fluid is called amniocentesis, right? That is amniocentesis. And remember, I told you about lumbar puncture on the last video. I said that you do it on the level of L3, L3, L4, right? So this lumbar puncture is also, they also do it to do what? To extract cerebrospinal fluid from what? From the level of the spinal cord, right? From the level of the spinal cord. So they know that where the spinal cord ends, whereby we said it ends at L1, L2. After it ends, we withdraw, or we take the cerebrospinal fluid from L3, L4. Then they take this cerebrospinal fluid, which is mainly just, it's just a clear liquid, right? But from that clear liquid, they can test, because it's supposed to have certain molecules and not others, right? So the cerebrospinal fluid is able to tell them that if you have any infection in your brain or not, right? So on the major areas of the brain, I just want us to deal with few major functions that are happening there, right? And move to the side. So the major functions that are happening, guys, I won't write everything, but what I want you to know is that, again, if this is your brain, right, you have your brainstem, you have your pons, and then it descends like that, and then you have your cerebellum, right? Remember that I said on top of the brainstem, what do you have? You have the diencephalon, which is not shown here, right? Don't worry, we are going to do everything later on. Then you have the medulla oblongata, here you have the pons, and then you have the midbrain. On top of the midbrain, you have the diencephalon, right? In the diencephalon, that is where you find your third ventricle, right? So the major functions that are happening in the frontal lobe, which is, if this is the parietal lobe, the frontal lobe is this part, right? So before we can even go there, what is forming the brain? If we show it from the top, right? If we show it from the top view, like looking like at it like that, we have something that is dividing it into half like this. We call this what? Central sulcus, right? This is how you differentiate the frontal, and it's like it divides the brain into the anterior and the posterior sections, right? The central sulcus. And then you have, remember that the brain is not straight, right? It's not smooth, I mean to say. So you have a depression, right? You have a line going like that, then you have another one going like that. The one, since this is the anterior, right? And we name from the anterior going to the posterior, this region, this bump before the central sulcus, we call it the pre-central sulcus, and the one after, immediately the one after the central sulcus, we call it the post, right? It's called post-central sulcus. This post-central gyrus, this is pre-central gyrus, right? This is the central sulcus, meaning, remember that I just told you that the sulcus divides two gyra, right? So meaning, if we take this section, if we cut it, right, you see this is the precentral gyrus, then you have the central sulcus, and then you have the post central gyrus, right? So the pre and the post, they are very important, but We'll discuss the functions later on, right? In front of it, we have what we call motor area. In front of the precentral, right? We have what we call the motor area. And then going on the post central, we have the somatosensory area, right? But I'm going to show you later on somatosensory. And then, since we are talking about the areas of the brain, anteriorly, somewhere here, I'll tell you the correct junctions, like where they meet actually. We call it Broca's area. This is your motor speech area. Meaning that if this area gets damaged, you won't be able to talk, but you'll be able to hear someone and you'll be able to understand what they're saying, but you can't respond. And then we have somewhere here what we call Wernicke's area. Both the Broca's and the Wernicke's area, they are both speech areas, but this one is sensory. This one is sensory speech area. Meaning, if it's sensory, it means that you can't hear what the person is saying. You can't understand what they're saying. You can't understand what they're saying, but you can be able to respond, right? So it means if you damage your Wernicke's area, you can't understand what the person is saying, but you can respond. If you damage your Broca's area, you can't understand what they are saying, but you can understand what they're saying, but you can't respond. So if they're both damaged, you can't understand what people are saying, and you can't respond either, right? So that is your Broca's area and Wernicke's area. They like asking questions about those areas. So going back to the major areas, right? We said in front of the precentral, you have your motor area, and then just posterior to the postcentral gyrus, you have your somatosensory area, right? So I'll tell you, the motor area is not just one area. It has other areas, and so is the somatosensory. But we'll do that later on, right? And then the diencephalon, I already told you that it is the central core, right? You find it in it's on top of the midbrain, right? And it is surrounded by cerebral hemispheres, as you can see. And it consists of 3 head structures, which is the gray matter. And on another, while you are on gray matter, remember that the outer part, the cortex of the brain, the outer part of the brain is called the gray matter, and then the inner part is called the white matter. But in the white matter, you have areas which are grayish. We call the gray areas which are found in the white matter, we call that what? The basal nuclei. We are going to do the basal nuclei in more detail, right? If your textbook allows us to do that, because in I don't think in the introduction to anatomy, your level, you do basal nuclei in more detail. But if it goes more deeper, I'll do it, right? But I don't think it does. And then from there, I was going to tell you about the major functions, right? So in the frontal lobe, the major functions is your movement, it's thinking, its behavior, the memory, and so forth. And then in the parietal lobe, you can think of sensation and reading, right? The temporal lobe is mainly hearing, right? Temporal lobe is mainly hearing, but we'll do that later on. And then the brainstem is involved in breathing. So to be specific, the most part that is involved in breathing is your medulla oblongata, right? And then you have your balance, your blood pressure, and everything. But what I want you to understand is that in the cerebrum, but now we've divided it into lobes, the frontal and the parietal lobe. That is where most of the things are happening, right? That is where most of the things are happening. Then we have what we call the blood-brain barrier. Remember when we spoke about the blood-brain barrier, we said which cells are responsible for that are in the blood-brain barrier, or that form the blood-brain barrier, which it allows only certain molecules to pass on to go to the brain, right? So the blood-brain barrier is a protective mechanism that helps maintain the brain stable environment. So it's basically homeostasis, right? And it has impermeable tight junctions, which are endothelial cells, right? So they are very small, so hence they don't allow structures to pass through to the brain. So while we are still on the, I think that should be it for now, because guys, from here I just wanted to give you the overview, and then later on we'll dwell deep on more structures. But for now, when you have the clear view of the ventricular system and how the specific brain lobes are divided, and you know what is a fissure, you know what is a gray matter, and you know the different, what you call it, the different lobes, as I said, and you know where is the diencephalon and the major areas, just like the Wernicke's area and the Broca's area and the precentral gyrus and the post and everything, then it will be easier for me later on when we go deeper to other structures, when we talk about the cerebral cortex and all those things. It will be easier for you to understand some of the things that I'll be discussing, right? So for ventricular system, there's not much to know, but what you have to know is that it flows from the cerebrospinal fluid, flows from the lateral ventricles, and then, okay guys, let's do it later, because now I have to tell you about what is called the interventricular foramen, which is the foramen between the third ventricle and the lateral ventricles, for the cerebrospinal fluid to come here, right? Because if I do this record, if it takes long, and then it will take longer to upload, which means that we'll only receive it later, of which it won't be fair to you guys, because we said that we'll have a live session later on, right? So the major things that I wanted you to understand here were the meninges that are covering the brain, and the major functions, which I'll repeat later on, right? And then as for the basal nuclei, I told you that we'll do it later on, because there are major structures, like it's complicated. So if your textbook is there, so in the meantime you can check if your textbook goes deeper to discussing the basal nuclei, and if it does, we'll do it later on, because I'll end up giving you things that are not even in your textbook, right? And then we'll do the cerebellum. So meaning later on what we'll do, we take the cerebrum differently on its own, we deal with the cerebrum, we finish. We take the temporal lobe, we deal with it, we finish. We take the cerebellum, deal with it, and then we deal with the brainstem. So basically the brain can be divided into three major parts, right? It's your cerebrum, it's your cerebellum, and brainstem. Only those three, right? From the cerebrum, that is where we get the lobes. But the brain itself, it can be divided into three main parts. Some of the textbook like saying that we have three brains, right? But that's not the case. We can divide it into the cerebrum, the brainstem, the cerebellum, and we can even add the diencephalon, because the diencephalon is not part of the brainstem, right? So we can say that it's divided into four main parts: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the brainstem, which constitutes of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, and then you have the diencephalon. In the diencephalon, that is where you find the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and all those things, right? We'll do them later on, right? But for now, I'm just let, and then we are going to talk about what we call the homunculus, right? We'll do it later on, because I can't draw it, because it requires me to show you a certain picture, right? So that is it for now, guys. I don't want to confuse you. And then if you didn't understand something on the previous videos, you'll tell me, because we still have to discuss the histological classification, if you didn't get it, the bipolar, the unipolar, and the multipolar, and where they are found in the process of myelination, if you didn't understand them. If you understood them, it means that I don't have to explain anything, and then we'll just do questions maybe tomorrow, so that you check if you did understand or not. From me, that's it. Thank you.